right? Micah and and remember, at this point, we have gotten out of the nations that are surrounding Israel, coming in and subjugating them and oppressing them. All right, now we're getting into basically a narrative, a description about how far the children of Israel had fallen away from God. All right. You know, at the very beginning, if you remember when Joshua led those children of Israel over that river Jordan, and they went in there, and every one of them to a man said, we will obey what God tells us to do. What you tell us to do, we will do it. And for a long time, they were faithful. I mean, you know, there were always, you're talking about a huge group of people. But by and large, as a people, they had not fallen away from God. They were still in obedience to Him. They were still worshiping when they were supposed to worship, where they were supposed to worship, in what manner they were supposed to worship. They were still doing what they were supposed to do. However, they had already given a little bit of an inkling when they didn't do everything God told them to do when they came into the land of Israel. And if you remember, that was drive out the other nations. Put an end to it. God said, if you'll do it, if you'll go and do it, I'll be with you. I'll help you do it. But they left off. They didn't go as far as they needed to. And listen, we're about to get to the end of Judges. Probably next week we're going to finish up Judges. All right. Okay.
How many the original group that left Egypt and was in the promise? How many of it? Just about half that when they went in with Joshua. You know
Well, remember, they wandered in the wilderness, and all of that previous generation died away. The people that were going into the promised land were the young generation that had not engaged in the sin of their fathers. So you're talking about an entirely new generation anyway. That when we're reading this, and this is even further down the road. So this is. But again, remember, we have to remember this. And I was talking to Miss Anita's family. And we were talking about that idea that if you don't teach your children are not going to know. They're just flat out not going to know. And what was happening is the children of Israel were not busy instructing their children because their children were beginning to fall away. And whether they simply didn't teach them, or they weren't acting as the example, that happens. Now, we can be the very best teacher that we possibly can be, and our children may fall away. But if they fall away and it's our fault, we're going to be held responsible for that. We're going to fall into judgment of God. But what's happening here is the things that we see over the next several chapters are going to be the direct consequence of the children of Israel not in obedience to God. These people had, and remember it says, and there was no king in Israel in those days, and every man did what was right in his own sight. Now you notice it says did right, but how do they define right? Well, my decision. It's not what God says, it's what I say. If the two coincide, that's great. But if it comes down to it, I'm going to do what I want to do, and if my desire comes in conflict with God, I'm going to continue to do what I want to do. That's the problem. And we said last week about the idea that there was no king in Israel, and guess what? There truly wasn't. God wasn't even king in Israel. God wasn't even in charge, because every man was simply doing what he wanted to do. Now we can look at that as an earthly authority as well. There was no strong authoritative figure in Israel. There was no one that was busy prophesying to the people and standing up as a leader, as Joshua was and as Moses was. And as you go a little bit further, the more righteous judges, you don't have those anymore. Now, no one is, even if somebody were to stand up and prophesy, no one was paying attention to them. So there was no earthly king, and they put God off the throne. They'd taken God off of his throne in Egypt. I keep wanting to say Egypt, in Israel. All right. So that's the problem. There's no authority figure, so therefore every person is doing what was right in their own mind. All right. Now we look at Micah. Just go back to Micah. Did Micah think that he was doing something appropriate? Yeah. In his own mind, he thought he was doing something that was appropriate. However, we saw a multitude of issues with Micah's decision on how to worship God. He was going to ordain his own son, not acceptable. He was going to ordain the Levite. He had no authority to ordain that Levite. He made the money that he gave his mother back after stealing it from her, gave it back because he feared the curse that was on it. He took a graven image and a carved image from his mother that was made out of some of that silver. So he had established his own little priestly kingdom right there in his own house. Well, none of what he was doing was acceptable. The only thing that you could possibly say was good, and even then that's debatable, was the fact that he wanted to worship God. But if you want to worship God, how are you going to worship him? The way you decide or the way he decides? Well, he wants us to. Okay? There was a specific place to offer sacrifice. There was a specific place to give back to the Levites. There was a specific place to do all of these things. And it wasn't in this man's house. And unfortunately, that's what he had done. So we're talking about a change of attitude and a change of behavior amongst the Israelites. And we're going to see here, this is a difficult passage. Let me tell you. The next two chapters are very difficult to read because this is different when we read it in Genesis, and we'll see here in just a couple minutes. There's some things that are the same. So let's go into this really quickly. All right. And I'm going to read a little bit, and then we're going to kind of stop where we can and do this. All right. In those days when there was no king in Israel, a certain Levite was sojourning in the remote parts of the hill country of Ephraim, who took to himself a concubine from Bethlehem in Judah. Now, there's a lot of discussion. What is a concubine? Well, just doing a little bit of research, I want to know what the biblical version of concubine was. A concubine is simply this. It's a woman with whom a man lives without the benefit of marriage. Now, there may be reasons for that marriage not being able to be consummated or performed, a wedding ceremony performed. Number one, it could be a difference in social status. All right? I'm not reading the scripture yet. I'm just giving a definition of concubine. But it does say he took a concubine from Bethlehem in Judah. So he took it from this particular place and took this woman. And we have to be careful. See, some people want to read it as the reason she's a concubine is she's a woman of ill repute. We don't find anywhere in that. Okay? It just simply means that this was a woman that for some reason, for whatever reason, he would not have been able to marry. Now, here's one of the things. It could be that he was already married. He was a Levitical priest. He may have already been married. All right? So it could be that since he was already married to one woman, he couldn't legally be married to another woman, so he took this concubine. We don't see anywhere where the woman had another husband, because we'll see here in just a couple of moments the relationship between this man, this Levite, and the woman's father. So it could be due to a difference in social status. He may have been higher born than her, and for that, and understand, this is in direct relation to this. I'm just explaining what a concubine is, not her as a concubine. It could be due to social status, social rank. It could be a pre-existing marriage that would have not allowed two people to be married to one another. Religious prohibition. If it's interesting, it's interesting to note that when the first proclamation against marriage in the Catholic Church, a Catholic priest could not marry, but he could take a concubine. Which makes absolutely no sense. It's wrong for them to marry, but it's not wrong for them to cohabitate with a woman that's not their spouse. I mean, that's about as irreligious as you could get. But there again, when there is no king in Israel, every person is going to do what's right in their own sight. It could be because of a pre-existing marriage, could be religious prohibition, and it could be a lack of recognition by appropriate authorities. It could be that one person is back in the day, you would have if a Catholic and a Protestant wanted to get married in certain countries, they were not allowed to get married. The authorities would not legally authorize that marriage. They would not recognize that marriage. So two people would come together and they would cohabitate with one another. They couldn't marry. Nobody would marry them. So by definition, they are cohabitating, and she's not his spouse, so she's a concubine. That's just an explanation of what concubine is. We're not given to know what the reason was that he took this woman as a concubine, but he did. All right, let's go on. She went away from him. In verse 2. And his concubine was unfaithful to him. She went away from him to her father's house in Bethlehem at Judah, and was there some 4 months. Now, here's an interesting, an interesting note about this, the idea that she was unfaithful to him, and I tend to read it along the lines with other biblical scholars. If you go to the Revised Standard Version and the American Version, it says that she played the harlot against him. She was unfaithful. But in the Revised Standard Version, it says that she left him because she was angry with him. If you look at the context in which that was written, that tends to make more sense. The fact that she left him simply because they had an argument. Here's the reason: because he went after her and persuaded her to come back to him. She left him to go and do this thing. Went to her father's house. You don't typically go back to your father's house in order to play adultery, to do adultery. As well as the penalty under that adulterous charge would have been death under the law. But that's not what we find. He goes back and he entreats with her to come back to him. So I tend to go along the translation or the understanding that she left him because they had an argument. They were angry. She and you know how things go. I'm going to go back to mom. I'm going to go back to my mom. So she gets up. She's angry. They have a fight. She leaves and goes back. But what happens? He goes after her, right? He goes. That was just the term that would be used. She was still, they weren't married, but they lived together as husband and wife, but they were not married. That religious aspect of that relationship's not there. Okay? All right. So then her husband arose and he went after her to speak kindly to her and bring her back. That's more along the lines of a man that's wanting to bring back somebody that he's had an argument with, rather than, why would he go back to her and entreat her and speak kindly to her if she's the one that committed adultery against him? That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Again, this is minutia. The bigger point behind this is coming here in just a couple moments. All right. So when the girl's father saw him, he came with joy to meet him. Okay, I'm sorry. I skipped forward a little bit. He went after her to speak kindly to her and bring her back. He had with him his servant and a couple of donkeys, so he's traveling with a little bit of an entourage. And she brought him into her father's house, and when the girl's father saw him, he came with joy to meet him. And his father-in-law, the girl's father, made him stay, and he remained with him 3 days. There's probably a couple of cultural reasons with this. For one, his daughters come back to him and probably very upset, maybe crying, maybe angry. What's going on? We had a fight. Oh, and he's thinking, look, you need to go back and be with your husband. You need to be with your husband. You need to be with your husband. Even if he's not considered her religious husband, he's still the one that's married, that's technically involved with this woman. So he's we need to go back. You need to go back. So when his son-in-law, according to the scripture, comes through the door, and probably maybe as we would think about it, maybe flowers in one hand and a box of chocolates in the other. Listen, I want you to come home. Please come home. Let's talk about this. Let's make up and let's go back home. Well, the father is very excited about this, reasonably so. His daughter and her common-law husband are going to make up, and they're going to go back home again, which is what needs to happen. So his father-in-law, the girl's father, made him stay, and he remained with him 3 days. So they ate and drank and spent the night there. And on the 4th day they arose early in the morning, prepared to go, but the girl's father said to his son-in-law, strengthen your heart with a morsel of bread, and after that you may go. So the two of them sat and ate and drank together. And of course, minutes turned into hours, and hours turned into more hours and more hours. And the girl's father said to the man, be pleased to spend the night and let your heart be merry. When the man rose up to go, his father-in-law pressed him until he spent the night there again. And on the 5th day he arose early in the morning to depart, and the girl's father said, strengthen your heart and wait until the day declines. Why travel in the heat of the day when you can wait until it's cool, and you can travel and be a lot more comfortable? Makes sense. All right. So they ate, both of them. And when the man and his concubine and his servant rose up to depart, his father-in-law, the girl's father, said to him, behold, now the day is waning towards evening. Please spend the night. Behold, the day draws to its close. Lodge here and let your heart be merry. And tomorrow you shall arise early in the morning for your journey and go home. Now, up to this point, what is the father has been doing what? Has been engaged in what? Man, incredible hospitality. I mean, this is genuine hospitality. No, don't go. Stay 3 days, stay 4 days, stay 5 days. I imagine if he'd given in, he would have had this man stay there for a week or two. He was this is an example of what hospitality meant back then. And we're going to see this in sharp contrast to here in just a couple of verses. We're going to see a clear line between what is acceptable and what is expected versus what is not given, what we find in the Scriptures. Okay? So this father is just overflowing with generosity, hospitality. Stay, eat. Let me give you a little bit of food, and to talk and to continue. It's kind of like when you go over to somebody's house and they, can I get you a cup of coffee? And then they get you a cup of coffee, and then pretty soon, would you want a piece of pie? My wife just baked a pie, or I just got something out of the oven. Let's have some of this. So you sit down and eat, and pretty soon you sit there and you talk and you talk. I've been on visits sometimes where I sit across the table and I got a cup of coffee, and I look up and I've been there 2.5 hours, and I was only going to be there for 30 minutes. Well, this is what's happening. All right, they're reclined at table. They're eating the food. The servants are bringing in food, and they're eating, and they're enjoying each other's company. And then pretty soon, boom, there you go. Now it's night. No, stay, just spend the night. Well, here's the thing, and this is going to be the sad part of it. It's ironic that the man's hospitality leads to partially what's going to happen a little bit further down the road. Not intentional at all, but unfortunately it does. It's fairly unintentional irony. Okay, so what happens? Verse 10, but the man would not spend the night. He said, I've been way long enough. It's time to go. It's cool of the evening. Let's travel. Let's get on the road and let's get going. So he arose up and he departed and arrived toward Jabus, that is Jerusalem. This is the town that will eventually be known as Jerusalem. Jabus. And he had with him a couple of saddle donkeys, and his concubine was with him. And when they were near Jabus, the day was nearly over, and the servant said to his master, come now, let us turn aside to the city of the Jebusites and spend the night in it. And look at this. Here's a first interesting point. Number one, the man would not spend the night in a town of foreigners. He would not spend the night in a city that was inhabited by foreigners. Even though they were in Israel, they were still foreigners. They were part of a heathen nation. They were the Jebusites. He says, I don't want to turn into them. I don't want to go into them. I want to go towards the city of my brethren, which makes perfect sense. Why? Well, we'll get to that here in a second. So here you have Jabus. Reasonably, he could expect that when he got into the city of the Jebusites, he wouldn't receive hospitality. He wasn't of them. He was an Israelite. He wasn't a Jebusite. And in his mind, I don't want to go there. For one, I shouldn't have anything to do with this city of the foreigners. You know, God told me I'm not to take part in them. I'm not to associate myself with them. And I likely will not be able to expect any kind of hospitality because they are not my countrymen. They're not my brethren. So he said, no, what are we going to do? Verse 13, come and let us draw near to one of these places and spend the night at Gibeah or Ramah. So they passed on and went their way, and the sun went down on them near Gibeah, which belongs to Benjamin. Okay, so here we have Gibeah, the city of his countrymen. And here he can reasonably expect to have hospitality. Somebody turn for me to Leviticus 19. Leviticus 19. Verses 33 and 34. Leviticus chapter 19, verses 33 through 34. And whoever has it, go ahead and hold forth.
And if a stranger dwells with you in your land, you shall not mistreat him. The stranger who dwells among you shall be to you as one born among you, and you shall love him as yourself. For you were strangers in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God.
Okay, so here we have a command by God. This is not simply a suggestion or an admonition. This is a command by God. How are the Israelites to treat the people who are sojourning among them? Like they were themselves. You would treat a foreigner who was sojourning. Now we have to understand, a sojourner was not someone who meant ill towards them. You're under no obligation to treat an enemy combatant who is in your land that way. But one who is sojourning, who is traveling, either going through or maybe coming in to stay for a while, you treat them as you would your own countrymen. Well, how would you treat your own countrymen? What's the obligation to how you treat your own countrymen? You would show absolute, it was whatever you need. When you come under my roof, you're under my protection. I treat you like my own family. When we serve dinner, you get the choicest portion. You recline at the head of the table. You would sit next to the patriarch. You would come and you would sit. It was just, they bent over backwards with hospitality. Well, with this kind of expectation for the Levite, he's traveling. He says, no, I'm not going to go into this pagan town, this Jebus. I'm going to go up to Gibeah. It belongs to the Benjaminites. These are people that I can count on, I can depend on. So reasonably expecting that when he gets to Gibeah, he's going to find a place to stay overnight, maybe even a couple of days, maybe to get provisions together, and then they'll proceed on. All right, but we're going to find out that's not what happens. So let's continue on. And behold, in verse 15, and they turned aside there to go in and spend the night at Gibeah. And he went in and sat down in the open square of the city, for no one took them into his house to spend the night. Right off the bat, we see this is unthinkable. This is unthinkable. This is an Israelite. This is one of God's people. He is a Levite. And here we have, he goes into a town of his own countrymen, and no one, and we don't read whether anybody spoke to him or not. If he went and asked, we can assume, there's a couple of ways we can go about this. He went and asked, and everyone said no. No one approached him, and if we see, we could go back and we could see when somebody would come into town, you would approach them. Do you have anywhere to spend the night? Why are you here? Come into my house. Okay, so there would be an active hospitality, not simply passive, waiting for somebody to ask. That's a lesson to us today, isn't it? Sometimes we think, well, we're hospitable, but we're passively hospitable instead of actively hospitable. That's just an aside lesson, but I think it's an important one to us today. We have to be actively hospitable. Going out and doing whatever, finding something to be hospitable about. He would have been, and that's the thing. The people were expected to provide for the Levites. That was their responsibility. Okay, yeah, absolutely. If nothing else, somebody should have opened up. If at the very least, should have opened up a barn or a stable of some kind. Even Joseph and Mary had a stable to stay in. This man didn't have anywhere, so he was going to spend the night in the square. Again, not unheard of, but when you've got countrymen, there's no reason he should have been staying out. Somebody should have opened up their home to him. Let's continue on. So he was going to spend the night in the square. Now, I want you to think about another Old Testament story where we hear this same thing going on. I remember Genesis, here's Lot in Sodom, and two men come in, and they say, do you have, see, Lot was active in the hospital. Well, do you have a place to spend the night? Well, why are you here? Come and spend the night at my house. No, we'll spend the night in the square. Absolutely not. And they found out later why he didn't want them to spend the night in the square. It's a bad idea. Okay, but we see another example of this. We're going to see how this one does not turn out quite so well for the people there. And behold, an old man was coming in from his work at the field in evening. The man was from the hill country of Ephraim, and he was sojourning in Gibeah. The men of the place were Benjaminites. And he lifted up his eyes and saw the traveler in the open square of the city. And the old man said, "Where are you going, and from where do you come?" And he said to them, "We are passing from Bethlehem in Judah to the remote parts of the hill country of Ephraim, from whence I came. I went to Bethlehem in Judah, and I'm going to the house of the Lord." Now, the idea of the house of the Lord at this point, the Ark of the Covenant and the tabernacle was actually in Shiloh. So when you would go and you would offer up sacrifice, you were going to Shiloh. Shiloh is a pretty good distance from where they are in Gibeah. So he still has a pretty good journey left to go. But he says, I'm not going to, this is not permanent. I'm heading on my way somewhere else, but I need a place to spend the night. He said, and I'm going to the house of the Lord, but no one has taken me into his home. I can imagine how difficult that would be. If we pull into town and we don't have a hotel room, we might be out of luck. We don't have that same mindset as before. But you know what? If somebody called the church building and said, "Hey, listen, we're coming into town. Is there any way possible we can't afford a hotel? Is there any way possible anybody could put us up?" I'll bet you that it'd be fairly easy to find somebody to say, "Hey, listen, I can do it for a couple of nights, and maybe we can go back and forth." But anyway, here's the issue. This man has come into town with people who are dependent on him, with livestock that needs to be watered and fed, and no one is doing anything for him. And this was a town of his own countrymen. Very, very disappointing. And they are certainly not fulfilling the word of the Lord. But if you remember, there is no king in Israel. So these people had left off even the simplest idea of hospitality to their own countrymen. Continuing on. "We have straw and feed for our donkeys, with bread and wine for me and your female servant and the young man with your servants." There's no lack of anything. In other words, we can even take care of ourselves, but we have nowhere to go. And the old man said, "Peace be to you, I will care for all your wants. Only do not spend the night in the square." Now, we don't see here that the old man, he's a sojourner as well. We don't see that he knows what's going to happen. But he simply says, hey, listen, you don't need to be spending the night in the open square. That's not called for. Come and spend the night with me. I'll take care of everything. Don't worry. You keep your bread and your wine. You keep the food for your donkeys. I'm going to take care of you, everything you need. So he brought them into his house and gave the donkeys feed, and they washed their feet and ate and drank. And here's where it takes a very dark turn, and this shows how depraved the children of Israel had become, how depraved God's people had become, since there was no king and everyone did what was right in his own sight. This is how depraved they had become. As they were making their hearts merry, they were enjoying each other's company, eating and drinking wine, eating bread, probably engaging in conversation. They knew people in common. Who knows? But they're making their hearts merry. Behold, the men of the city, worthless fellows, surrounded the house, beating on the door. And they said to the old man, the master of the house, bring out the man who came into your house that we may know him. Where does this sound like? Sounds very much like Sodom. That's exactly what the men of the city said to Lot when they knocked on his door. And after he had taken these two men into his home, said, bring them out but that we may know them, folks. Go to the translation of that and you know exactly what that means. They want to engage in sexual intercourse with these men. That's how depraved they had become. They're engaged in depraved, degenerate behavior because there was no king in Israel. And every man was doing what was right in his own sight. All right? And they said to the old man, the master of the house, bring out the man who came to your house that we may know him. And the man, the master of the house, went out to them and said, no, my brothers, do not act so wickedly. These were brethren. This is not just people who live there. These are people, these are children of Israel. These are part of God's people. My brethren, do not act so wickedly. Since this man has come into my house, do not do this vile thing. Now here we're going to see where the concept of hospitality, actually in my opinion, takes a very wrong turn. But this shows how important hospitality was to the people of that time. When you came under someone's roof, you were under their protection. You would lay down your life for someone that had taken refuge or taken shelter in your own home. Even to the point where you would even sacrifice not only yourself, but you would sacrifice your own family for the protection of these people. Look what he says. Behold, here my daughter, a virgin daughter, and his concubine. So he's going to take two women who have no part in this whatsoever. Let me bring them out now. Violate them and do with them whatever seems good to you, but against this man do not do this outrageous thing. Here's where, again, that idea of degenerate, depraved behavior takes center place. There is no. Let me ask you this: do you know of a single man, if a group of people came to his door and demanded that from them, would not do everything within his power to protect the people under his control and under his authority? I can't imagine a man who would say, "No, this is my friend, this is my visitor. You can't touch him. I'm going to bring out my daughter, and you can have her." Absolutely not. I think this is when hospitality has taken second place. Okay? But again, we're talking about a group of people who had become degenerate and depraved. All right? Violate them and do with them whatever seems good to you, but against this man do not do this outrageous thing. And this was behavior that would have been reprehensible. It's reprehensible now, it was reprehensible then. But the men would not listen to him, so the man seized his concubine and made her go out to them. And they knew her and abused her all night until the morning, and as the dawn began to break, they let her go. We're talking about this is animalistic, depraved behavior. I can't say it any other way than that. This is something that now would land you, hopefully, in jail for a great many years if you didn't have somebody going out for revenge. And that would be understandable as well. But again, we're talking about a people who have left this mindset. They've adopted this mindset and they've left the mindset of God. They no longer have the mind of God. They have the mind of animals. And as morning appeared, the woman came and fell down at the door of the man's house where her master was until it was light. And her master rose up in the morning, and when he opened the doors of the house and went out to go on his way, behold, there was his concubine lying at the door of the house with her hands on the threshold. I'm not sure what exactly he expected to happen. This is a woman that he actually pursued after they had an argument, had entreated her to come back, and instead of defending her the way he should, allow her to be violated. And we see here, look at what he says. He said to her, now look at the callous behavior on his part. I mean, this is unthinkable behavior. He said to her, "Get up and let us be going." That's the mindset. You know, it's just, words escape. But he let this happen. He allowed her to go out. He pushed her out the door. They took her and did whatever they wanted to her, brought her back, and now she's dead. She's died because of what happened to her. He says, "Get up and let us be going," but there was no answer. She had died. Then he put her on the donkey, and the man rose up and went away to his home. And when he entered his house, and I think he's making an example here, and we'll see here that this actually has something that happens a little bit further on. This informs something that happens a little bit further on. But now he's going to make a statement. After all of this is said and done, after he sees the depraved, for one thing, the indifference of his countrymen towards himself, I imagine now, though, he's probably glad that he didn't go to a lot of these men's homes, because there's no telling what would have happened to him there. But there was indifference in regards to hospitality, and then there was outright hostility on the part of his own countrymen towards him and his concubine and his servant and all of the things that he had, as well as the man that gave him shelter. And when he entered his house, he took a knife, and taking hold of his concubine, he divided her, limb from limb, into 12 pieces, and sent her throughout all the territory of Israel. In this, I believe what we're seeing here, and I believe that the Scripture bears it out, what he is doing here is he is making a statement about basically the blood that you see, the blood that's been shed, the blood is on all of your heads because you have all abandoned God. God no longer has a place in Israel. Everyone is doing whatever they feel is right. That man did what he felt was right. The men of Gibeah did what they felt was right. And this is the end result of it. This is the end result of it. But you know...
All of them were responsible for what had happened.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Listen, this didn't happen. This didn't happen overnight, and it certainly didn't happen without some sort of impetus. It didn't happen without some sort of trigger. So what was the problem? Well, for one thing, the people were not being told. They were not being informed. They had rejected God's authority. You know, I like to think that all of us here, we don't have to have some strong central authority figure in order to remain faithful. But some people apparently do. Unless there's somebody riding, what the old saying, riding herd on them to make sure they do what is right, there are those who apparently, in the lack of any kind of overt physical authority that you might find, they abandon God. They just abandoned Him. All of these things, none of what we read here, that's happened here should have ever happened amongst God's people. Now, in the old days, when Lot has to defend his family or his visitors from the men of Sodom, that we could possibly understand that because they were a godless people. You know, we could say, well, you know, hey, listen, they're without God, they're heathen, they're pagan, they don't know any better. These are Benjaminites. They know better, or should have. I don't know if they did, to be honest. I don't know if they've been taught enough to know better. But at the end of the day, they had a responsibility, and they failed their responsibility, and then they did things that they weren't supposed to do. Now, we look at it today. You know, we think about how horrific, this is just an awful thing to have happen. But folks, listen, if we look around and we see the that's why I don't watch the news very much. I'm very disappointed when I watch the news. I'm inevitably disappointed. But we see the things that are happening in this world today because people have turned their back on God and God's authority. There is no God. You know, that idea, there's simply this. We've replaced God as king, and there is no God in wherever. I mean, you know, in Georgia, in Douglasville, in Smyrna, in U.S., whatever. That's what we've done. We have basically turned our backs on Him. Now, does that mean that everybody in the United States has to become a Christian, become a theocracy? Not at all. But we have to make sure that we're doing what our obligation and our responsibility is. We call sin when we find it. But you know, now we're called bigots and hateful people when we simply speak the truth of God. This behavior is wrong. Well, you can't say that. You're just being hateful. You're judging. Only God can judge. And that's what we're up against. But it doesn't stop us. We have to engage culture. We have to engage popular culture. We may not win, so to speak, but we have to at least engage it. And this is what's happened. The people have become degenerate, and they've fallen away from God. They've gone into apostasy. But he says he sent her throughout the territories of Israel, and all who saw it said, such a thing has never happened or been seen from the day that the people of Israel came up out of the land of Egypt until this day. Consider it, take counsel, and speak. Now, this is the interesting thing. If you go to, hold on just a second, let me find it. Let's see. Somebody turn to Hosea. It is, it's interesting that this one account is written down when there are probably many other accounts. Hosea 10:9. Hosea 10:9. We'll see here in a couple seconds where Hosea actually writes about this, and it is commonly believed that this may be the linchpin or the tipping off point where the children of Israel began to arouse God's ire to the point where He was going to remove them. This is when they really went off the rails. Because, it says, such a thing has never been seen or happened before. From the time of the Exodus from Egypt, this has never happened before. So this was a monumental event. When you're sitting there and all of a sudden somebody comes into town and they said, by the way, this is for you to show how to accuse you in your disobedience. And they unwrap it and there's a portion of a human body. And then the tale is told about what happened. It's pretty bad. What does it say in Hosea chapter 10 and verse 9? Okay. The battle in Gibeah against the children of iniquity did not overtake them. Now we're going to see in the next couple of chapters. We'll see in the next couple of chapters, and that's going to end it. Next week we'll finish up. That there was going to be reckoning. There's going to be a day of reckoning against these people for what they had done. Unfortunately, the problem is when they engage in this corrective measure, it doesn't go far enough. They don't completely remove the stain of what had happened. They don't remove the evil from amongst their midst. But when we think about it in those terms, really, that's where they had fallen short pretty much from the very beginning. They had not gone as far as God told them to go. They held off. They withheld their hand when they should have pressed on. And listen, an example to us today is the idea of purging out. When we try to get rid of sin in our lives, how often do we go, we'll go so far with it and then we just won't go all the way. I'll get rid of this and this and this, but this I just can't let go of. This is just too important to me. It's too close to my heart. I can't do this. And that's what happened to the Israelites, and that's what it came back to bite them many, 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 many times. Get rid of these people. Don't associate with them. Don't enter into covenants with them. Don't intermarry with them. Don't allow them into your homes. Don't allow their shrines and their worship, places of worship to remain standing. And he did all of this. The whole point of being God's people is they were to be separate, and that was the problem, is that they had not been separate. From the very beginning, they had intermingled with. They had not done everything God told them to do, and because of that, their hearts were turned away from God by the godless that surrounded them. And here we get to the point where we see what happens to this Levite. We see his depraved indifference to the fate of his concubine. Then we see the depraved indifference that these men had to the point where they abuse this poor woman until she's dead. And we wonder, well, how could something like this happen? How could people sink so low? Well, what do we? What's that?
When they took the first step away.
When they decided that the mind of God was no longer sufficient, that having the mind of God was no longer important, and so that's what happened. You have a group of people who, if this is okay, then this must certainly be okay. Isn't that a problem with sin anyway? If you acquiesce or you give in to a small sin, a bigger sin is just a step down the road. Why can't we do this? If I can do this, why can't I do this? And that's unfortunately where they are. So next week we're going to talk, if you want to read chapters 22, hang on a second, chapters 20 and 21, and as I said, that'll finish us out. You'll see what that the children of Israel, they'll go so far but not far enough. Not as far as they need to do in order to purge the evil. So take a look at that for next week. Anybody got anything they want to add? It's a terrible story. And we have to remember this, that just because it's written in the Bible doesn't mean that it's okay. Many times what God has written down and what He's seen fit is to document history. It doesn't mean that what was happening was acceptable. For example, this Levite, this man saying, "Here, look, I'll bring out the concubine and I'll bring out my daughter and I'll give them to you." We can't look at that and say, "Well, God was okay with that." No, God wasn't okay with that either. We're just simply documenting what happened. And we can glean from it what's going to happen. We're going to see where there's some people who will pay for what they did, and they're going to pay for it with their lives. I mean, there's a battle royal getting ready to come down on the people of Gibeah, and it's a bad one. It's a big one. So we'll finish that up next week. Anybody got anything they want to add?